You're tuned in to True Crime Stories.
On April 15th, 2013, the Boston Marathon was underway in Massachusetts. It is one of the largest annual sporting events in the United States, drawing tens of thousands of participants and spectators. The race route runs through multiple cities and ends in downtown Boston, where crowds gather near the finish line. By mid-afternoon, runners were still crossing. At that point, the event was proceeding as expected. Then, at approximately 2:49 p.m., an explosion occurred near the finish line on Boylston Street. Seconds later, a second explosion followed a short distance away. The blasts happened in an area where spectators were densely gathered. Emergency responders, race volunteers, and medical personnel who were already on site for the event moved in immediately. From the outset, it was clear this was not an accident. The response shifted quickly from event support to emergency management. Victims were treated at the scene and transported to nearby hospitals. Law enforcement secured the area and began assessing what had happened. Initial reports focused on the devices used. Investigators determined that the explosions were caused by improvised explosive devices placed near the finish line. The devices had been concealed and triggered during a time of peak activity. At that point, the focus moved to identification. Because the location was heavily populated and widely documented, both by official cameras and by public footage, there was a large volume of visual evidence available. That created an opportunity, but it also created a challenge. Investigators had to sort through extensive footage from multiple sources to identify who had placed the devices and how they had moved through the area beforehand. At this stage, the public did not yet know who was responsible, but the investigation was already underway. In the days following the bombing, federal and local agencies worked together to analyze evidence. The FBI took a lead role in the investigation, supported by Boston police and other agencies. One of the primary tools was video analysis. Surveillance cameras from nearby businesses, along with footage from media outlets and bystanders, were reviewed to track movement near the explosion sites. From that analysis, investigators identified two individuals who had been in the area carrying backpacks near the locations where the devices detonated. Still images of the suspects were released to the public. At that point, authorities were asking for assistance in identifying them. But before that process could develop further, the situation changed. On April 18th, several days after the bombing, a separate incident occurred on the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. An MIT police officer was shot and killed. Shortly after that, reports emerged of a vehicle being taken in what investigators later identified as a carjacking. The individuals involved in that incident were believed to be the same suspects connected to the bombing. At that point, the investigation became an active manhunt. Law enforcement agencies began tracking the suspects across the Boston area. The situation escalated overnight, leading to a confrontation in Watertown, Massachusetts. During that confrontation, explosive devices were used again, and there was an exchange of gunfire between the suspects and police. One of the suspects, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, was critically injured during the encounter and later died. The second suspect, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, fled the scene. This created a new phase of the investigation. Authorities issued a shelter-in-place advisory for residents in the area while they searched for the remaining suspect. Public transportation was limited. Businesses were closed. Law enforcement conducted a systematic search of neighborhoods in Watertown. There was a limitation. Despite the scale of the search, the suspect was not immediately located. And as the day progressed, the search area expanded. Later on April 19th, after the initial search operations had concluded for the day, a resident in Watertown reported something unusual. A boat in his backyard had been disturbed. When police responded, they discovered Dzhokhar Tsarnaev inside. He was taken into custody. At that point, the immediate threat was contained. The investigation then shifted toward prosecution and understanding the full scope of what had occurred. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was charged with multiple federal offenses, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction. The case proceeded through the legal system. In 2015, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. That sentence has been subject to appeals, which are part of the federal legal process in capital cases. From an investigative standpoint, the case involved multiple stages: identification, public assistance, escalation into a manhunt, and eventual capture. It also reflects a broader pattern in large-scale incidents. Public events with open access create environments where threats can be introduced without immediate detection. At the same time, those environments often generate extensive documentation, which can later support investigations. In this case, that documentation played a key role, but it required time to process. And during that time, the situation continued to develop. The case also highlights how quickly an investigation can shift. What began as a post-incident analysis became an active search within days, involving multiple jurisdictions and agencies. The response ultimately led to the identification and capture of the remaining suspect. But like many cases of this scale, the resolution followed a sequence of stages rather than a single moment.